All right, this is the last session of a very long body of work, ethics curriculum, building algorithm ethics and learning objectives associated with really this new concept, and hoping to train ethics officers in algorithm ethics as we've defined it as a group and as a collective. And so this is our last session, crowdsourced. Katrina is going to lead us out in a moment on diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback, and what that means with respect to the ethics committee and instances of ethical choice. Next week we will do, and we have another session planned. It is a wrap-up session where we will talk about how we will take all of this work and carry it forward. But the answer is really a large document that we will pull together with all the groups sort of pitching in different parts, and then creating some connective tissue and transitions through the writings. But we'll begin to work on that next week. This week it's Katrina and her team, and so I will hand off to you. Thanks, Katrina.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Happy July 13th, everyone. Give me a moment here while I share my screen. Okay, everybody can see that? We're all good? There we go. So diverse input and multi-stakeholder feedback. Dorothea, Joshua, Tristy, and I have had a lot of fun over the last several weeks building a bit of a curriculum and kind of working through this. What we're going to do is we're going to do a presentation of about 30 minutes. I'm going to ask everyone to hold their burning questions for now. We promise there'll be lots of time to have discussion. We actually welcome discussion, really want to get your feedback on this work. But for now, just if you can give us the stage for a bit, we'll present some of our thoughts. And just to kind of give you a sense of what we're going to go over, we're going to do a little bit of context setting, some level setting with some definitions, and then we're going to segue into some concepts that we think are really important that kind of layer onto the definitions and the context. Then we're going to try our hand at a use case. I'm always a big applied person, so we wanted to see if we could take some of the theoretical things we were talking about and apply it to a use case. And then we're going to talk a bit about some of the limitations and challenges in our work. You'll find in the appendix a full list of all the learning objectives. We are not going to cover that today in the presentation, but we will post this presentation and you can go in and take a look at all the learning objectives, see how they tie back to things that we've talked about in the GDPR and the DPIA and other places, but we're not going to cover that today in the presentation. So that's a bit of an overview of what we're about to do. And I'm going to start by handing off to my colleague, Joshua, who's going to do a little bit of level setting for us. So over to you, Joshua.
Yeah, here's Katrina. So as Katrina mentioned, we're going to start off with the context, sort of the ForHumanity context, which obviously is quite important to understanding what it is we're trying to achieve when we define these terms and these concepts later on. So what is it that ForHumanity is interested in when it comes to diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback, and why? So if you could go to the next slide, Katrina, please. Right, so in short, the reason that we are interested in diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback is because including diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback is a major part of ForHumanity's approach to building an infrastructure of trust. And there's sort of 2 or 3 main reasons that this materializes within the ForHumanity framework. The first one being the algorithmic risk analysis, which is kind of a cornerstone of the GDPR audit, and which by definition requires diverse inputs from a wide range of stakeholders. So as we see here, the algorithmic risk analysis is defined as an analysis and hierarchical comparison prepared by a diverse team of assessors designed to analyze the likelihood and severity of consequences to people or people groups and the systemic impacts of an algorithmic system. And the crux of it is to ensure that human agency remains a factor that is being paid attention to throughout the design, development, and the risk assessment process of an algorithmic system. And so within that, within the GDPR audit in general, there's several learning outcomes, as Katrina mentioned. They're all in the appendix. You're welcome to look at them. There's several learning objectives that call for diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback. So that's another reason why it's important that we define it. For example, the learner shall know what diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback means. The learner should know how the process is executed and see the feedback from these groups. Moving on, the DPIA, the Data Processing Impact Assessment, also calls for diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback. So yet another reason why that's important. For example, it says the learner should understand the value and impact of diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback. The learner should know that when assessing the riskiness of the processing, diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback should be included. And finally, the learner should know how to identify that the diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder and the stakeholders are good composites for input to fairly assess the risk in question. And so this sort of starts to lay the land. It shows us that essentially what the ethics officer is going to need to be able to do is two things. There's two major sort of layers of ethical choice that they're going to have to deal with on a regular basis. And these will be reiterated several times throughout the presentation, within Katrina's section as well, I think. But essentially it comes down to, first of all, knowing how to determine what an appropriately reasonably diverse group of multi-stakeholders looks like for a given algorithm. And second, they need to know how to sort through these inputs and feedback to make recommendations for amending and improving the model in question. And obviously, in order to do that, the ethics officer, just like all of us, need to first know what diverse inputs are and what multi-stakeholder feedback means. So now we'll be moving on to the next section, the definitions. So what our team did was we started by separating the phrase diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback and finding sort of the operational term, most likely diversity. And we started by trying to define this. And we found that diversity is often sort of mystified or politicized and put on this pedestal as this super complex issue, which it is when you get into the nitty-gritty. But at a basic level, diversity itself as a term is not a complicated or a controversial word or concept. And this bears out when you see the dictionary definitions, which is why we decided to start with those and factor those in quite heavily into our understanding. So for example, the first dictionary definition we found, the fact of many different types of things or people being included in something. Or alternatively, the fact that there are many different ideas or opinions about something. So again, it's important to see here that these are not normative phrases or definitions or prescriptive ones. They are just descriptive ones. They just describe a situation in which there are many different things or a variety of things. And if we move on to the Ferris University definition, which we found very helpful in terms of its scope, you see that there's different sort of dimensions of diversity that people can pay attention to. The usual suspects being race, sex, age, gender, but it goes far beyond that, because really diversity, as we see, really just means variety. And you can have many different levels of variety. You can have variety to do with age, sex, gender. You can have variety to do with sexual orientation, social class, physical attributes, religious or ethical value systems, national origin, political beliefs, even just opinions in general. And so this is something that's important to remember when we're talking about the word diversity. And so now putting it back together with diverse inputs, it becomes clear that really all diverse inputs means is feedback, insights, opinions that are collected and considered from various different sources. Now, so to summarize, essentially the diversity of a situation is in the end a function of how many variables are grouped together and of how different those variables are from each other within that group. So now moving on to the next slide, we come to this issue of reasonableness, and this is where the normativity starts to come into play and the descriptiveness starts to sort of not fall away, but become less relevant. Namely, what needs to be done is we need to make a qualification on this previous statement about diverse inputs referring to feedback, insights, opinions that are collected and considered from various sources. Because the way we can think about it is that diverse inputs acquires a normative quality because there's sort of a silent syllable or letter coming before it. It's actually a word, and that word is reasonable. What ethics officers need to be able to do is not just gather the most diverse possible inputs. And there's two reasons for this. First of all, it wouldn't be feasible because the most diverse group of inputs is every person on the planet. Because the more detailed you look at individuals, the more clear it becomes all the different ways they differ from one another. And so the most diverse sample group is just everyone there is. And that's not a reasonable standard to be demanding of an ethics officer to get the input from everyone on the planet every time there's an algorithm. The second reason is that a lot of this input, if you were to do it this way, if it were feasible, would not be relevant because different algorithms do different things, and those things and those impacts are relevant to different groups of people. And so diversity, we need to not think of it just in terms of as many different groups of people, but also in terms of how diverse are you being with regards to the dimensions of diversity itself? Are you looking at just age? Are you being diverse in terms of age groups? Are you being diverse in terms of age group, sex, gender, and however many other things? So there's sort of two levels to diversity in that sense. And so essentially what that means, or what that shows us, is that the ethics officer doesn't need to get the most diverse possible group. What he needs to, or he or she needs to be able to do, is to gather appropriate and reasonably diverse inputs based on the situation or algorithm at hand, excluding the things, or maybe not going or putting them high on the priority list if they're not as relevant as other people. And so really making this determination is sort of the crux of what he or she will have to be able to do. And so now moving on to the next slide, sort of the final factor in the equation of diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback is the word stakeholder, or multi-stakeholder feedback. And here we had a few different questions which we actually would like to pose to you guys, hopefully discuss in the Q&A later on. But essentially what we did was we didn't distinguish too critically between diverse inputs and multi-stakeholder feedback. We looked at it more as sort of a comprehensive term that belongs together. So in that sense, multi-stakeholder feedback just means feedback inputs coming from several different kinds, diverse sources / stakeholders. And so it kind of just bolsters the first part of the diverse inputs. Whether that's a fair way to do it or conceive of it is something that, again, maybe other people have different thoughts on. Maybe there is a distinction that is important and that does need to be very clearly made between the two. But yeah, so essentially moving on now to the ForHumanity definition of stakeholders. It refers to those impacted or affected by algorithmic risk. As we see from this learning objective, the learner shall be aware that key stakeholders when it comes to securing ethics of automated decision-making are those directly or indirectly affected by the application of automated decision-making in question. And here, this brings us to the second sort of major question that we sort of wrestled with a fair bit during our discussions, which was, does this ForHumanity definition differ considerably from the sort of colloquial or general definition of stakeholders, namely that which refers to those who have a stake in an organization? So essentially, the concern is that maybe the standard definition is more restrictive than the ForHumanity definition, in that it only talks about people with an actual stake in a company or organization, whereas ForHumanity is talking about anyone who is affected directly or indirectly. And this indirectly part, depending on how you understand these terms, may be an issue for some people. So we decided to stick to the ForHumanity definition for reasons of uniformity and simplicity. But it was an issue that was brought up and that did sort of take up a considerable amount of time, I think, during our discussions. And so we thought it was worth mentioning to you in case anyone had any ideas about that. But yeah, so that's essentially it. All taken together, the ethics officer needs to be able to do two things: bring together a reasonably diverse group of people to give inputs and feedback on the impacts of an algorithm, and then step two, sort of triage those inputs and figure out what to do with them. And here I will be handing off to Katrina for some more practical stuff now that we have the lay of the land.
Thanks so much, Joshua, for giving us that level setting and definitions. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to layer on a couple of other concepts. And some of this, as Joshua was saying, is the stuff we really wrestled with as a group. And that's why I want to highlight it. And then I'll segue into kind of the application piece. So the first thing I really want to talk about is I don't think we can have a fulsome discussion about stakeholders and diverse feedback without talking about power. And that's really something that we wanted to highlight when it comes to these issues. And so I just want to frame this in two different ways. We started out our conversation as a team by having a really fulsome discussion about stakeholders. Is stakeholders the right term? And how do we define stakeholders? And what entered into that discussion too was this notion of rights holder. And rights holders have legal entitlements. They're not necessarily optional. You know, rights holders have entitlements that are demanded. And what I'm seeing in some of the conversation as we kind of shift from a really shareholder-centric view of organizations, which might have been aligned with this sort of idea of it's okay to do harm as long as we're kind of doing the best for ourselves and our shareholders, to this more fulsome conversation around stakeholders, which might be centered around this concept of, well, we're not going to do harm, we're going to be more inclusive and have more people at the table, to this kind of next layer of promoting well-being and kind of being more proactive, which is kind of aligning with more of this idea of rights holders. So this is just something that, you know, is kind of in the cultural zeitgeist. I will also say our whole team does not agree on all of this. I mean, hence modeling some of the diversity and multi-stakeholder feedback within our group. But this is something that was kind of like debated within our team. And then I wanted to also raise this saliency stakeholder model, which has a long history. It's been around for decades. It's used a lot in stakeholder work. I'm not going to unpack this model in a lot of detail, but the main purpose of this model is just to show, first of all, stakeholder versus non-stakeholder. So traditionally, stakeholders have been thought about as holding some power, legitimacy, or urgency to kind of get themselves onto the map as a stakeholder. But what we're seeing is if we kind of look at affected communities who aren't necessarily considered traditional stakeholders, they might lay outside of this traditional mapping. So I think this is a good visual to kind of think about stakeholder and non-stakeholder. And then as we move, we think about this like concentric circles and we kind of move towards the center of this. We see that those in the center tend to have the most power. They tend to kind of get their position you know, on the agenda more often than not. And this has traditionally been shareholders, people who are on the board of directors of organizations and so forth. And then there's the folks in the middle. They might be latent in that they only have one of these three attributes, or they might have two of these three attributes. But basically the idea is just to kind of frame this idea of power as, you know, those kind of being on the inside versus the outside. And I'll touch on this again when we come to our use case. That's as far as I'm going to go about that diagram and talking about power. Moving on to some of the other things, the things that we discussed and wrestled with and felt were important to note. First of all, there's lots of different ways of gathering stakeholder feedback. You know, we can look at this not just in the context of the work we're doing, but, you know, the richer, wider body of work around, you know, doing surveys and interviews and focus groups and how these exchanges and how we collect diverse multi-stakeholder feedback. There's a wide body of work on that. We also wanted to flag this idea of cultural appropriateness. As a global community, I think we all, you know, come from different contexts, and there is definitely a sense that this work would be contextualized and made culturally appropriate for the particular context that it's being done in. And then touching back on this idea of reasonableness, we had quite a lot of discussion about this, and Joshua's already raised some of the challenges around this. What is a reasonable level of engagement? Who gets to decide what is reasonable? How do we know that we've achieved that? And then how do we take that reasonableness? So there's sort of this reasonable level of diversity within the group itself. Did we consult with a diverse enough pool of people? Then there is the input itself. Did we get a diverse range of input from that group of people? And then we layer on the application of that. And that kind of speaks to this power piece as well. Whose voices were heard? How is this feedback incorporated? What did that process look like? And so all of this is taking place within this bigger, you know, stakeholder engagement life cycle. So these are some of the things we had a lot of really good discussion about, and we hope to get some discussion going within this group about some of this as well. Then we kind of zoomed in, and what we've seen throughout our entire curriculum is we've had these places in the agenda where we have an icon or you know, a kind of a notation that says make an ethical choice, insert ethical choice here, consult diverse and multi-stakeholder feedback here. But we really wanted to kind of zoom in and look at what does that look like. And Tristy was part of a working group that found this particular ethical decision-making framework. It's from the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority. And the point we want to make here is not so much that we're advocating for this particular framework, so much as we're advocating for a framework to be put in place for around ethical decision-making. So one of the things that our group noticed is that throughout the ethics curriculum, we haven't really talked about ethics all that much. It's come up here and there, but it hasn't necessarily been centered. And so we're not going to go into a deep dive of unpacking that today, but we wanted to raise that point, and we wanted to just note how this ethical decision-making framework can help an ethics officer, can help an ethics committee to wrestle with these challenges, and that it's important to have a framework, especially when you have a diverse group of people at the table, really understanding how these decisions are going to be made. So we just wanted to note that. So that's a zoom in. This is a zoom out. And I had originally at one point wanted to try and make my own map of taking all of our content and trying to figure out where does the diverse multi-stakeholder feedback fit into all of this. And I got some feedback from various team leads about it. And at the end of the day, what I was trying to create was looking a bit like the dog's breakfast. So I kind of abandoned that project. And I landed on this responsible design process instead, which I think is a close approximation of where I wanted to go with this particular concept. And what I was hearing from everyone and what I've been seeing in the presentations is that this is really woven into the fabric of the process. And I think that this responsible design process, which is modeled on the double diamond design process, does a pretty good job of highlighting that and highlighting where ethical choices are made and highlighting this idea of kind of consulting with diverse communities. It's not perfectly aligned, but it's a good approximation. And I also wanted to just kind of say that this is backed by a paper. So this is kind of has some grounding in the IEEE well-being framework. It's backed by a paper that I think does a pretty good deep dive into some of these concepts from an ethics lens. I'm not going to go into that, but I just wanted to note that, and that might be something that we put into, say, the body of knowledge or, augmented content that supports some of the work that we've done. So there is a paper that backs this. So that's kind of the zoom out. To kind of get like super granular, because I always try and think about how are the things that we're recommending theoretically actually going to be applied in the real world. And so we really wanted to challenge ourselves by taking a use case and seeing if we could look at it from the perspective of diverse multi-stakeholder feedback and try and understand what the recommendations would be that we would make. So we took a popular use case, one that I think everyone here is pretty familiar with, and that's the case of Amazon's hiring algorithm. And we asked ourselves this question around how we would apply our recommendations around diverse multi-stakeholder feedback to this particular scenario. Now, there isn't, other than the media reports about what actually happened as an outcome of this scenario, we didn't have a lot of detail about what actually did happen. So some of this is speculative, but I think it's still useful as a bit of an exercise to go through. So one of the things we looked at, this kind of question of how diverse is diverse enough? And in the context of something like a hiring algorithm, which has, high stakes consequences, we really felt like a broad definition of diversity in this case, or a broad definition of diverse would be appropriate. And so we kind of, again, laid out some of the groups that we thought might be good to include as part of our stakeholder analysis. We talked a bit about intersectional identities. So that's kind of the landscape that we presented. We also wanted to ensure that we had the appropriate domain expertise at the table. So just kind of noting, again, depending on the context, what kind of domain expertise you're looking for in the context of a hiring algorithm. Perhaps that looks like HR expertise, legal expertise, people who are well-versed in EDI. Those kinds of domains might be relevant to this particular context. Looking at who was on the development team, at Amazon, putting this algorithm together, what did that look like? Was the team diverse? What were the gaps? How are we addressing those gaps? And then talking a bit about the process of consulting stakeholder groups. When were they consulted during the process? Was it, before or after? What did that look like? What information was gathered? How was it incorporated into the decision-making process? How is all of this documented and who got to decide at key points in the process? Really kind of analyzing and looking at all of that could be instructive for this particular case. So this isn't meant to be an exhaustive analysis of this particular case. It's just meant to take some of our theory and tie it to something practical in the real world. So that's the point of this. So as with any work or any kind of framework, there's always going to be limitations. There's always going to be challenges. And I think it's really important to note some of that. Our team, again, this is where a lot of the discussion and kind of differences of opinion came in. And I think it's good to just highlight some of this stuff. So in thinking about, diverse multi-stakeholder feedback, what are the limitations? I mean, certainly this is important, but it may have some limits to it. This idea of diverse enough, this idea of reasonableness, again, is something that I think we've mentioned it many, many times throughout this presentation. It's something that I think needs to be wrestled with, analyzed, and thought about in more detail. The idea that technology companies are not diverse places, on the one hand, is sort of an opportunity and speaks to the need for this kind of work to have diverse multi-stakeholder feedback. On the other hand, it feels like a deficit and kind of starting from a place where you're already at a deficit of diversity, and not just diversity in the sense of what's visible, but also when we think about a Silicon Valley narrative or the culture of tech, there's kind of a lack of diversity of thought that might be seen in that particular industry. There's also, we touched on the power dynamics, but the one thing I wanted to kind of note about this is there's power dynamics within these diverse communities as well. So when we think about all the different stakeholder groups that we're going to be consulting, within those groups, there's power dynamics. There's an interesting example of that happening right now off the coast of British Columbia with a logging company and an Indigenous group, and the company thought they'd consulted appropriately, and because of the different power dynamics within the Indigenous community itself, there's sort of this sense of have we actually done enough consultation. So those are the kinds of things that we can look for too, is like power dynamics within power dynamics. And accounting for the diversity we don't see can sometimes be challenging. So this is what Joshua was talking about in terms of diversity of thought and all of these things that are not really visible. How do we account for that and ensure that we're kind of being diverse enough in our gathering of input? And then of course, the unknown unknowns, just the things that you can't necessarily foresee or you can't really analyze well until you're kind of in a post-hoc analysis situation, and just sort of noting that, that's a limitation too. So that is, I think we're kind of right on time here at 10:30. We have lots of time for questions. We really want to have a good discussion with you. As mentioned, I'll just kind of scroll. We do have all of our learning objectives here in the PowerPoint, and we're going to post this PowerPoint so that others can go through it and have a look. But that's really our presentation. So I guess I would open it up to questions from anyone.
Well done, team. Anybody want to kick off? I mean, I could jump in there. All right, good. Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, it's great stuff. First of all, what a subject to try and distill into half an hour. What's striking me actually is a suggestion for maybe consideration as we go along, because I think the limitations on access to suitably diverse groups and ability to work out how to define diversity in the potentially impacted group to then align with an appropriately diverse stakeholder group. I think the how much is enough questions are going to be probably the biggest practical challenge. And something I've been involved in is the Cynefin complexity framework. I've been invited to have a conversation about that. They have what's called a sense maker framework, which is basically access to thousands of people with defined demographics who they invite to contribute to stuff through survey to create basically a human algorithm, a human feedback model of people that cut across all community groups. So I'm wondering whether there might be some kind of partnership with us. I know that we were talking internally about maybe providing diverse inputs as a service, as an organization, as one kite flown. But anyway, that's I don't want to take us off track. I think as foundation, it's fantastic. But yeah, I've got I'm mindful of that sort of practical how much is enough point.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Sarah, would you mind putting the name of that group in the chat? I think many of us might want to take a look at some of the work that they're doing.
Absolutely, and I think they've open sourced a lot of their principles for that sort of management of complexity. There's a lot of alignment in it. I'll definitely do that. I'll circle back and do that either now or in the channel later.
Gwen, you had a question, but maybe it was answered. What?
No, I just wanted to put my hand out so I could focus on what Sarah was saying. My question was about, first of all, thanks for the presentation, guys. My question was what Josh said about whether or not we should distinguish between diverse inputs and diverse stakeholders, and diverse feedback. And I was just wondering, I mean, assuming that the inputs are kind of like the development team, and then feedback is, the development team then going and consulting with other people and getting feedback. Assuming that's what those words mean, then it seems to me that there is kind of a hierarchy between those two positions, and that one is a lot more influential in kind of the development of an algorithm, kind of the core structures. And so I think that seems to me to be a relevant distinction to make. But I was wondering what you think about that, and if I'm wrong about those definitions.
Josh, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I agree with Gwen's. I can see both, really. I mean, when it seems to me like maybe they're two sides of the same coin, and in that sense they are different, but they're very related to each other in the sense that the diverse inputs come from like many different stakeholders, or from the feedback that is given by stakeholders. But I would also agree with Gwen's view that you could make that distinction in that way. And I don't know if everyone else agrees, and I think that we should probably do that. But I still think that it wouldn't make a huge difference in so far as substantively changing sort of what comes after that point in the presentation. Like I agree with that, with the distinction, but yeah, so I think that's compatible basically with what we've done. I don't know, Katrina, what do you or Tristy or Dorothea or anybody else?
Yeah, I'd love to. Dorothea, do you want to weigh in on some of this stuff?
No, I missed the exact difference that Gwen was proposing. I am very sorry.
I'll say it again. I can say it again, because I also think maybe I didn't say it very clearly. I guess I was thinking it sounds like the distinction between those two groups is the distinction between the actual developers and then people that the developers then go and consult with. Is that correct?
I mean, I can't say. So you say like the diverse inputs are those who are consulted, and the stakeholders are those who develop.
No, the other way around.
The other way around. So whatever. I think for me it doesn't make or add any significant clarification, if I may say. I mean, I would have preference to focus on diverse inputs only and leave the term stakeholders aside, because as we discussed in the chat, or like as people discussed in the chat, stakeholders generally means like everyone who has a stake in the organization. And then Ryan said, well, we could talk about having a stake in the automated decision making, which is an interesting other perspective, but like starting from a conventional point of view, so everyone who has a stake in the organization that develops the algorithm, then you would have investors, employees, communities that are, where the company pays tax, etc. And there's no way we should ask these classical stakeholders about the impact of an algorithm. So the conventional way doesn't work. So then who has a stake in the algorithm? Again, developers. I mean, who has a stake in the developers and those impacted by the use of the algorithm, either directly or indirectly. So that might work. In that context, we could still, I think, stakeholders having a stake in the algorithm could work for me. But that's, I mean, I promised actually I wouldn't start the discussion, but kind of couldn't hold back. Sorry.
And you shouldn't hold back, Chris.
So I think Sarah put her hand up first, but anyway, I'll
No,
go.
but Sarah spoke once already, so I'm
okay,
fine.
all right.
You were about the same time, so I called on you first.
All right. So my view of stakeholders, I think I put it on chat. I mean, if we look at the life cycle of AI, right, and for organizations developing it in-house, then for me, stakeholders is everybody that potentially can contribute to the positive outcomes. So you've got the developers, obviously, right? They're developing, the designers, data scientists. You also should involve people within the GRC community. So people that can look at risk from a different perspective, augmenting the views that the data scientists would take. because the data scientists, their job is to get the solution, designed, built, and out and ship out the door in the shortest possible time frame. But they necessarily will, are not likely to be thinking about, okay, so what could be the unintended consequences, because their lenses, very, very, or the views are very narrow. So I think the whole GRC population should be a consultant, and obviously the data management population as well should be consultant, because you got the other data fuels these algorithms. So and if you want to extend that beyond the organization's perimeters, then using surveys and so forth, your end in financial services, your customers that use the outcomes of those algorithms, should have the opportunity to provide feedback. So over time, continuous monitoring should capture those feedback signals, right, and put it back into that loop. And so therefore, over time, you've got the opportunity to tune and align your the algorithms to how they should be performing and so forth. So for me, the stakeholder population, internal and external, should be those those people I've spoken about.
Sarah?
I disagree. I don't fully disagree. My perception of this is that all of those who are typically organizational stakeholders in the change and development process always get their say, more or less equally. I think this is about ethical choice. We are in the ethics curriculum. We are trying to fill in the missing piece, which is a decent cross-section of those potentially impacted, for good or bad, by the algorithm or automated system. I think the focus, it would be perfectly reasonable to include people within the business who represent some portion of that diversity, whilst acknowledging their accountability and responsibility within the process, because that will introduce bias. But I think our first duty with our definition of stakeholders here is to effectively represent the portion of the population who are potentially impacted, because the problem space we're operating in is the one where the 100 most cited machine learning research papers, only 2 of them mentioned adverse outcomes. So that's where I'm coming from.
And
yeah, just to kind of layer on that, and that's why we've hammered on the power thing a lot, because that traditionally that group has not been represented.
And you're right to do it, but we have to do it carefully. And here's what I mean by that. The word stakeholder has morphed substantially. For those of you not familiar with the etymology of the word, it started as shareholder/stakeholder. And where that came from was there were shareholders of companies, and they were the ones that mattered. And then people were like, oh, well, wait a minute, what about the employees? And suddenly it's like, oh, well, we need a new word to talk about all the people impacted inside of a company. But that was 40 years ago. Stakeholder now is really anyone who can be impacted, meaning they had a status quo and it was changed as a result of the function. Okay. And so it could be communities, it could be towns, it could be tax bases, it could be people adversely affected, it could be people positively affected. It really can mean anybody. And that's the terminology we should use. And that when we talk about power, we do have to recognize that even the adversely impacted will have some power. And what we want to do is we want to lift that up. And we want to empower people to talk about how, even as customers, even as consumers, even as people who are having decisions put upon them, okay, they still can vote in democracies. They can still boycott or not buy products. So there is some power there. And what we want to do is we want to amplify that and make sure that that is well known as their stake in the equation. Now, when we add diverse to that equation, what we have to be, this is what's failing in the United States. I don't want to speak for other countries, but what's failing in the United States is this idea that if I have a Black person in the room, and if I have a woman in the room, and if I have someone of a particular sexual orientation that they want to announce in the room, that somehow we have diversity. And if they all went to Harvard and got the exact same degree, we probably don't have diversity because they all think the same way. And what's the most important part, as Sarah pointed out, and Chris was saying a lot of the same thing here too, which is we have to make sure that they are given a voice to say, this hurts, or this might be a problem, or this could create a risk. And we need to protect against that and build those risk mitigations. Remember the mission here. Examine and analyze downside risk. The upside potential is going to go really well. Companies, designers, and developers, that's how they're incentivized. It's going to go well. So let's focus on mitigating those downside risks and identifying exactly what Sarah said, which is where is the adverse impact here. And you're going to get more of that actually from diversity of thought than you are of checking a box for diversity of characteristics. And by the way, diversity of thought's really hard. You know why it's hard? It's because when I say things like this and 5 people want to disagree with maybe how I even said it, you have to hear it. And you have to understand how they missed it or how they didn't understand you or how you explained yourself poorly until you can reach some sense of consensus and risk mitigation. Diversity of thought is harder than putting checkbox different protected categories into a room. I promise you.
So Ryan, if I can add to that, I think both are important because I think we're at a moment now where communities who haven't had a seat at the table are finally getting an opportunity to have that seat at the table. And I think that's important too. Like, even if they all did go to Harvard, I think there still needs to be some of that. So you could say, well, we've got diversity of thought. Everybody's a white male here, but that person's working class. They went to this college, blah, blah, blah. I don't buy that. Like, I feel that we need both. And I feel that there's space for both. And so I don't disagree that we need diversity of thought, and it is harder to, quantify or figure out what that means exactly. But also, I think it's important to have other communities who traditionally have not had a voice to be at the table.
Yeah, you can't have diversity of thought if you got 5 white males in the room. It's impossible. Most white males think very similarly, and from a power place for the last 400 or 500 years. So, but also the same thing is true if you have 5 black males. They come from a place as well. So diversity of characteristic. The reason we use this term diversity of thought is because if I've been an oppressed minority for a very long time, I think and operate differently. I might walk around my neighborhood scared. Me personally, where I grew up and as a white middle-aged man, grew up in a safe community, I've never walked around anywhere scared. I don't even know what that feels like. I don't even know what it feels like to think that way. That is a lack of diversity of thought, right? I can't even, it's hard for me to understand that. And so you do have to have, just like you said, Katrina, both characteristics in place, but it's the diversity of thought that will eventually help you to identify the risks that we need to uncover. And that's the most important thing, is to find these risks, mitigate them, build around them. Diversity of experience. Tristy just, for once, I can actually see the chat, which is so cool. It pops up. I can actually operate against the chat too. So diversity of experience, diversity of thought, the ability to identify these risks. That's the main thing that we want to focus on. And one more thing before I call on Josh. I do want to make sure everyone here knows, because it wasn't talked about, but this diverse input and multi-stakeholder feedback is an attack vector as well. And so security around this has to exist, and a consideration has to exist, because data poisoning can very easily happen here. And it needs to be factored into this process. And if it's being controlled by someone on an ethics committee, they need to be in a position to identify this risk and be able to manage and mitigate it. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of you, actually. I think I just wanted to qualify sort of the statement. Maybe, at least in my mind, the way I look at it always is that this characteristic diversity, as we might call it, like the superficial stuff, the skin color, whether you're in a wheelchair or not, and so forth, to me seems like a means to an end, the end being viewpoint diversity or diversity of thought. So it's not so much that it's a one or the other, at least in my mind. The superficial characteristic diversity is sort of a means to the end of You could think of it as like a utopia where we are actually beyond race and we have solved these systemic issues. And at that point, we no longer want to be filling quotas. I mean, the idea is that at that point, when we do reach that, if we ever do reach that, we will be at a situation where it really only matters what you think and no longer what you look like. And so if that's the end goal, then I think that, yeah, the other stuff is really a means to that end and an effective way to, or maybe an effective way to achieving that or getting closer to that.
And I think the only point I wanted to make, because Katrina and I are definitely on the same page, right? You want to build diversity of characteristics because that's going to help you get to that diversity of thought and experience and be able to think more creatively. There's a laziness that happens with solving all of these problems. And so people will take a checkbox approach where they look at a set of pictures or you filled out a survey and feel like you have diversity. And we have to guard against that. That's all. Yeah. Is because the real goal is to get to that higher level application. And it's hard. Again, this is why this is difficult. It's hard to sit in a room with people who are like, Ryan, you don't get it. Like, you don't understand where I'm coming from. And for me to set aside 49 years of experience and go, all right, let me try and hear you. Let me try and understand what it is that you're saying so that we can help mitigate these risks and challenges. It's hard work. And we need to recognize that. Dorothea?
Can I just make one
sorry,
more
yeah, Josh, go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, I would agree with you totally. And the other thing I just wanted to mention quickly, something that I was meaning to mention in the definition section that's also important to realize about diversity is that diversity is inherently divisive, because it literally means taking things that are different and putting them into one place and making them interact with one another. And so the more diverse a situation or group is, the more room there is for conflict, just by definition and by virtue of what diversity means. And so that's sort of an inherent challenge to diversity that needs to be kept in mind, I think, when we are trying to make things more diverse, is that you can't just throw a bunch of diverse people into a pile and say, all right, now fix this issue because you all come from different places. It's going to be more difficult to come up with a solution at that point because there will be many conflicting opinions. But at the end, the solution you do reach will very likely be way better than what you would have gotten if you had had a group of people who think so similarly that they could have given you an answer within 5 minutes.
Absolutely. Dorothea?
Yeah, so what I think about this avoiding of this whole thing being a checkbox exercise, like we need 3.1% wheelchair users and 5 Black and 4 of them, homosexual, etc., which totally does not make sense and will not represent diversity of thoughts. I think I agree with Josh, and also others have said in the chat that it's an approximation. It's like a first step towards, approaching diversity where we think diversity could lie in contrast to diversity among 5 males from Harvard. So there's a higher chance of finding diversity along these lines. But then, what decides on whether you really get meaningful diversity of thought is the method of engaging with them. And then it's up to constructing a good way of gathering feedback. So you cannot do a multiple choice, survey, whatever. Then you need to prepare the grounds for deliberation, open-ended discourse, and really listening to the voices. So the selection is one thing, and then the method of engaging them is another thing. And that's when you will realize or notice, do you have true diversity or not? Because especially diversity of thoughts is something that cannot be gathered through anonymous pseudo representative surveys. So I think that's what, where the procedure then will play a role. And then, yeah, we can kind of really make a difference.
Absolutely. Gwen?
So would that mean for an ethics officer, they might have to, if we really wanted to achieve diversity of thought, that might imply that the ethics officer has to kind of have some sort of rapport with everyone who's being consulted, who actually gets to know these people, maybe does like an interview or something.
I want to say it a little softer, Gwen. This is one of these places where we want to fall in love with the name of this group. We are for humanity. Okay. And so when you can have a heart and a love, and I know I'm using non-businessy terms here, I don't care. When you can have a heart and a love for hearing somebody and where their pain is, or where their risk is, or where their concern is, you know what humans do? They fix it. They solve it. And so if we approach this, if an ethics officer approaches this with the intent of help and love and care for stakeholders, you will get a different result. And oh, by the way, we're finally moving to a world where you can actually turn that into sustainable profitability because you love, because you care, because you think about these risks and these challenges. And that, to me, will be extremely reasonable, right? That will help you reach that goal of are we hearing what these challenges are and doing something about it? Chuck? You're on mute, Chuck.
As usual. So I wanted to share my thinking on the diversity definition. We've talked about diversity of characteristics and diversity of thought. And in my mind, what we are really talking about is diversity in perspectives, which by its very nature is a combination of your characteristics, life experiences, and your thinking. And so when I think about diversity of perspectives, in my experience in social modeling, I may have a census data that parses out of 3 million cases, 2.7 million unique cases. But to get to the diversity of perspective, then that brings it down to from 2.7 million to hundreds of thousands. And so I don't know how you really go about capturing the stakeholder diversity of perspective as opposed to characteristics, because those things are so much easier to measure and record. So that I think that the discussion has really been around the fringes of diversity of perspective as the key.
And you know, you're right. We're using different terminologies to make sure that we understand and people can hear the different ways that we want to say we care about what you think. And we care about where you came from or what your background was that might make you hear or see things differently. That message, because it's not used to being heard by the people who are affected or adversely impacted or not used to having a voice, sometimes you actually have to say it 2, 3, 5 times. Sometimes you have to go through a process before they actually feel like, oh, if I say something, something might happen, right? Because they're so used to being pushed down and marginalized. And so even this whole process of creating good mechanisms, I saw somebody put in the chat, right? In a roundtable forum, well, maybe they want to introduce confidentially their concerns to whoever might be leading the group. That is a great way for someone who's very uncomfortable in a circumstance to voice their concerns, but without having to be, you know, sort of called out, or maybe they're even shy and just not comfortable expressing themselves. So it really is very much about a process that needs to be built. It's an expertise that doesn't exist in the marketplace very well, right? And so this is one of those reasons that I do think ForHumanity may have a role to play in providing this service. When we come at it with the perspective of managing downside risk for all of humanity, which by the way is an absurd concept, right? How can we get all of ForHumanity? But it doesn't stop us from trying to be more and more inclusive when we do this work or when we hear what these risks might be. And so when you come at it with the right heart, I hope those of you who are here would put your hands up and say, look, I feel like I'm in a room where if I've got a problem or an issue, I can put my hand up and I can comfortably say, I'm nervous, I'm concerned, right? And so if you create that environment more and more and more, you're going to get better and better responses on adverse impact and risks to be mitigated. And that's what we want to really try to achieve with this. Josh?
Yeah, sort of something that came to mind when I was doing my studies in philosophy, I sort of love being or talking to devil's advocates. And I was wondering if maybe this is a tool that that ethics officers might be able to use as well when looking for diverse inputs. So if they don't even know where to start looking, potentially, again, I don't know if this really works down in practice, but they could maybe talk to the developers or the designers of said algorithm ask them for the reasons why they chose certain courses of action as opposed to others, and then to go look for people who are either in industry doing it the opposite way to their own developers and designers, or people making arguments, in academia or wherever else to the effect that this is the wrong way to do that. And so sort of by starting with the reasoning of the developers and designers, then looking for people saying the opposite of these things, and then going and reaching out to those people, asking why they think the opposite, what their reasoning is for why it's the wrong way to do things, and so forth, you might sort of have a starting point, at least, for gathering and kind of identifying where sources of these diverse inputs might lie.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the difficulty of even this operation, doing this work well, is you actually are creating counterfactuals, right? Because what you're doing is if you do this well, you're identifying risks and risk mitigation that you're going to take steps to prevent. So now you don't even have the, oh, it went wrong kind of thing, because you prevented it, right? So it's even difficult to prove out the value of this over time, because you're eliminating risks. And so even operating in that way is a challenge, and it requires some genuine skill and training. And I hope we will take what was taught here today and build around that in terms of how do you run this? Unlike most of the other ethics curriculum class, sessions that we did, where we could pull out instances of ethical choice and maybe identify thresholds or quantitative measures or what reasonableness is. To me, this is actually this is the core of your job as this algorithm ethics officer. And who are you? And what is the moral framework that you operate around? And how are you going to demonstrate and show this to people and help them to feel included and considered? And know that you have grown enough of a feedback loop to actually achieve this. That's the real sort of goal of this. Now, it's the top of the hour. I know people got a dash. We have been recording this, for those of you who don't know. What I'd like to do is actually stop the recording, but don't go anywhere. Let me stop the recording.